He thought he could humiliate her in his courtroom and walk away untouched, but he had no idea he had just stepped into the one case that would quietly dismantle everything he had built. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments below, and if you believe dignity still matters in this world, stay with this story, because what happened inside that courtroom would leave even the most seasoned attorneys speechless. The morning light poured through the tall courthouse windows, casting long reflections across the polished marble floors as people shuffled into courtroom 4B, a place where careers were often made or broken in a matter of minutes. At exactly 9 a.m., Judge Harold Whitman took his seat, his black robe perfectly pressed, his expression carrying the quiet arrogance of a man who had never been meaningfully challenged in years. He was known across the county not just for his sharp legal mind, but for something else, something less spoken yet deeply understood. He did not tolerate being questioned, and those who dared often found themselves regretting it. That morning, however, his attention was fixed on a name at the bottom of his docket, Emily Carter. To most in the room, she was invisible even before she walked in, just another minor case, another ordinary woman caught in a system too large to care. When the courtroom doors opened, she stepped in quietly, wearing a simple beige cardigan, her hair loosely tied back, her presence so understated it barely registered against the heavy atmosphere of authority surrounding her. A few people glanced up, then quickly lost interest. She looked like someone who didn't belong here, not in a room filled with tailored suits, polished shoes, and voices trained to command attention. Judge Whitman barely concealed his smirk as he adjusted his glasses and looked down at her file, already convinced he understood exactly who she was. "Ms. Carter," he called, his tone flat but edged with condescension, "step forward." The faint echo of her footsteps carried across the room as she approached the stand, her movements calm, measured, almost too calm for someone standing alone in front of a judge known for dismantling defendants with a single line of questioning. A few attorneys in the gallery exchanged knowing glances, the kind that said this would be quick, predictable, forgettable. But what none of them noticed was the way Emily's eyes moved, not nervously, not uncertainly, but observantly, as if she were quietly taking in every detail of the room, every position of power, every assumption already made about her before she had spoken a single word. Judge Whitman leaned forward slightly, his voice now louder, deliberately projecting to the room. "I trust you understand the seriousness of these proceedings, though judging by your background, I suppose that may be optimistic." A few quiet chuckles rippled through the courtroom, subtle but sharp enough to sting. He let the moment linger, confident, in control, certain that this would unfold exactly as he intended. What he didn't see, what no one in that room could have predicted, was that Emily Carter wasn't standing there to defend herself in the way they expected. She was standing there because she had already seen the flaw, the small, almost invisible thread in the case that, once pulled, would unravel everything. And as the room settled into that heavy, anticipatory silence, something shifted, not in the crowd, not in the judge, but in her, quiet, steady, and irreversible. The air in the courtroom settled into a tense stillness as Emily Carter stood at the defendant's table, her hands resting lightly against the polished wood, her posture composed in a way that did not match the quiet assumptions forming around her. Judge Harold Whitman leaned back in his chair, glancing briefly at the clock mounted on the far wall, already signaling his impatience without needing to say a word. To him, this was routine, another minor case that would be resolved quickly, another opportunity to reinforce his authority in a room that rarely questioned it. He flipped through the file with deliberate slowness, the sound of paper echoing louder than it should have, drawing attention to the fact that he controlled the pace of everything that happened here. "You are being charged with failure to comply with a municipal directive and failure to appear at a scheduled hearing," he stated, his voice carrying across the room with practiced precision. "Do you understand the charges against you, Ms. Carter?" Emily nodded once, her expression neutral, her voice steady when she spoke. "Yes, Your Honor, I understand what is written." The phrasing was subtle, but it lingered in the air for a moment longer than expected. A few attorneys in the gallery shifted slightly, catching something in her tone that did not quite fit the usual pattern of hesitation or confusion. Judge Whitman, however, dismissed it instantly, his focus fixed on moving forward. "And how do you plead?" he asked, his pen already poised above the document, ready to mark the outcome before she had even answered. "I would like to review the basis of the charge before entering a plea," Emily replied calmly. The request was simple, procedural, entirely within her rights, yet it disrupted the rhythm of the courtroom just enough to draw a few raised eyebrows. Whitman's pen paused mid-air, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked down at her, the faintest trace of irritation surfacing beneath his controlled exterior. "This is not a complex matter," he said, his tone tightening. "The documentation is clear." Emily did not move, did not raise her voice, did not challenge him directly. "Respectfully, Your Honor, clarity depends on accuracy," she said. The room did not react outwardly, but the silence deepened, shifting from passive observation to something more attentive. In the back row, a young associate attorney leaned forward, sensing that this might not unfold as predictably as expected. Whitman exhaled slowly, setting his pen down with more force than necessary. "Very well," he said, his voice now edged with restrained impatience. "You may proceed, though I advise you not to waste the court's time." Emily reached for the thin folder in front of her, opening it with deliberate care. Inside were neatly organized documents, each page aligned with precision that spoke of preparation rather than panic. As she glanced down, her eyes moved quickly, not searching, but confirming. Across the room, the prosecutor shifted in. His seat, his earlier confidence beginning to soften into uncertainty, though he could not yet explain why. Emily lifted her gaze again, meeting the judge's eyes for the first time without hesitation. "The notice for the original hearing," she began, her voice even and controlled, "was issued on a date that conflicts with the documented filing of the directive itself." A faint murmur rippled through the gallery, quickly suppressed but impossible to ignore. Whitman's expression hardened, though he said nothing. Emily continued, her tone unchanged, "Which raises a procedural question regarding the validity of the charge as it stands." For the first time that morning, the carefully maintained rhythm of the courtroom faltered, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to be felt. And in that quiet disruption, something began to shift, subtle, irreversible, as the assumption that had defined the room just minutes earlier started to unravel. For a moment, no one spoke, not even the faint shuffle of papers or the quiet tapping of pens that usually filled the courtroom between exchanges, because what Emily Carter had just said did not sound like guesswork or confusion. It sounded precise, intentional, and most importantly, correct. Judge Harold Whitman remained still, his gaze fixed on her, but there was a subtle change now, not visible to most, yet unmistakable to those who had spent years watching him operate, a slight tightening around his eyes, the smallest delay before he responded. "Clarify your statement," he said, his tone measured, but no longer dismissive. Emily lowered her eyes briefly to the document in front of her, then lifted them again with quiet certainty. The municipal directive referenced in the charge was officially filed on June 14th at 2:30 p.m., according to the clerk's timestamp, she explained, her voice steady, each word placed carefully. However, the notice for the hearing is dated June 12th at 9 a.m., which would mean the notice was issued before the directive itself legally existed. A ripple moved through the room again, softer this time, but heavier, more deliberate, as if the realization was beginning to settle in layers. The prosecutor shifted in his seat, flipping quickly through his own copy of the file, his earlier confidence now replaced by a growing urgency. Judge Whitman did not look down immediately. Instead, he held her gaze for a second longer than necessary, as if testing whether this was coincidence or something far more controlled. Then, slowly, he reached for the document and scanned the dates himself. The silence deepened. It was no longer passive. It had weight now, pressing into the space between every person in that room. "Clerical errors occur," Whitman said finally, though the certainty in his voice had diminished by a fraction. "They do not invalidate the substance of the charge." Emily did not interrupt. She waited, allowing his words to settle before responding, her restraint making the moment feel even sharper. "Respectfully, Your Honor," she said, "procedural integrity is what gives substance its legitimacy. Without it, the charge becomes vulnerable to dismissal." There was no challenge in her tone, no raised voice, no visible attempt to provoke. and that was precisely what made it land so heavily. In the second row, a senior attorney who had practiced for over 20 years leaned back slightly, his arms crossing as he studied her more closely now, no longer seeing her as just another defendant. The prosecutor cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the situation. "Even if there is a discrepancy in dates," he said, his voice a bit tighter than before. The defendant was still aware of the directive and failed to comply. Emily turned her head slightly toward him, acknowledging his presence for the first time. "Awareness does not substitute for lawful notice," she replied calmly. "The legal requirement is not assumption, it is documentation." The words did not come quickly, they came deliberately, each one placed with the kind of precision that did not leave room for easy dismissal. Judge Whitman's fingers rested against the edge of the bench, tapping once, then stopping, a habit he had when something did not align with his expectations. He glanced again at the file, then at the clerk seated to his right, who was now quietly reviewing the same timestamps with growing concern. And in that moment, the shift became undeniable. The woman they had expected to correct, to instruct, to dismiss, was no longer responding to the courtroom, she was guiding it, one detail at a time, one question at a time, without raising her voice or breaking her composure. And as the silence stretched just a little longer than it should have, it became clear to everyone present that this was no longer a routine hearing, and whatever happened next would not follow the script they had all assumed from the beginning. The courtroom no longer felt like a place of routine procedure. It felt like a space holding its breath, every person inside it quietly recalculating what they thought they understood just minutes ago. Judge Harold Whitman straightened slightly in his chair, his posture sharpening as if reclaiming control through formality alone, but the ease he carried earlier had begun to fade into something more rigid, more deliberate. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice steady but noticeably firmer, "you are making a procedural argument. That does not address your failure to comply with the directive itself." The statement was meant to redirect, to narrow the scope back to familiar ground, but Emily did not rush to respond. She allowed the silence to settle first, her gaze lowering briefly to her documents before lifting again, calm and unwavering. "It does, Your Honor," she replied, her tone even, almost quiet, yet impossible to ignore. "Because compliance is only enforceable when the directive is lawfully established and properly communicated." A few heads in the gallery turned, not dramatically, but enough to signal attention had fully shifted. The prosecutor leaned forward now, his earlier composure replaced by a subtle tension in his shoulders. The directive was posted publicly. He interjected, attempting to regain footing. It was accessible to all residents, including the defendant. Emily turned slightly toward him, acknowledging the statement with a small nod, as if inviting him to continue, but when he did not, she spoke again. "Public posting does not replace direct notice when a hearing is scheduled," she said. "The law requires verifiable delivery, not general availability." The words landed cleanly, without hesitation, and more importantly, without emotion. Judge Whitman's fingers pressed lightly against the bench as he glanced toward the clerk again, who was now reviewing additional records with increasing urgency. The subtle shift in the clerk's expression did not go unnoticed by those closest to the bench. "Clerk," Whitman said, his tone controlled, "confirm the issuance record for the notice." The clerk hesitated for a fraction of a second before responding, flipping through the digital log displayed on the screen. "Your Honor," the clerk said carefully, "the system shows the notice was generated on June 12th, but the directive reference number was assigned on June 14th. There is no prior record linked to that case number before the 14th. The words hung in the air, heavier than any raised voice could have been. A low murmur spread again, quickly subdued, but impossible to fully contain. The prosecutor exhaled slowly, his hand moving to adjust the papers in front of him, though the gesture now seemed more like an attempt to buy time than to organize his argument. Judge Whitman's gaze returned to Emily, but this time there was no trace of the earlier smirk, only a measured, searching look, as if trying to determine how far this would go. Emily did not look away. She stood exactly as she had from the beginning, composed, steady, but now there was something else beneath the surface, something unmistakable to those paying attention, control. "Your Honor," she continued, her voice unchanged, If the notice predates the directive, then the hearing itself lacks a lawful foundation, which means the failure to appear cannot be enforced under due process. The phrase settled into the room with quiet authority, not dramatic, not forceful, but definitive. In the back row, the same senior attorney who had been observing leaned forward again, his expression no longer curious, but intent, recognizing the precision of what was unfolding. Judge Whitman leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing, not in dismissal, but in concentration, as the structure of the case before him began to show fractures he had not anticipated. And in that growing silence, it became clear that Emily Carter was no longer responding to pressure. She was creating it, reshaping the direction of the courtroom with each carefully chosen word, while the authority that once dominated the room began, quietly and unmistakably, to shift. The silence that followed did not feel empty anymore. It felt charged, as if every word spoken from this point forward carried consequences far beyond a simple ruling. Judge Harold Whitman shifted in his seat again, but this time the movement lacked the effortless authority he had displayed earlier, replaced instead by a careful calculation of what could still be controlled. His gaze moved briefly to the prosecutor, then back to Emily Carter, as though weighing whether to push forward or redirect entirely. "Ms. Carter," he said, his tone slower now, more deliberate. "Even if there is a procedural inconsistency, the court retains discretion to proceed when the intent of the law is clear." It was a subtle pivot, an attempt to reframe the situation from structure to interpretation, but Emily did not react immediately. She allowed the statement to settle, her expression unchanged, her posture still composed in a way that now felt less like restraint and more like certainty. "Discretion does not override due process, Your Honor," she replied quietly. The words were not sharp, yet they landed with undeniable weight. A few heads turned again, this time more openly, no longer pretending disinterest. The prosecutor cleared his throat, his voice slightly strained as he stepped in. "The defendant is focusing on a technicality," he said, glancing briefly toward the judge as if seeking alignment. "The purpose of the directive was to ensure compliance, and she failed to meet that obligation." Emily shifted her attention toward him, her gaze steady but not confrontational. "A technicality is only minor when it does not define the legality of the action," she said. "In this case, the procedure determines whether the obligation itself exists." The distinction was precise, and more importantly, it reframed the entire argument in a way that made dismissal far more difficult. In the gallery, the quiet murmur that followed was no longer subtle curiosity, it was recognition. Judge Whitman leaned forward slightly, his fingers interlacing as he rested them on the bench, a posture he used when he needed to regain control through direct engagement. "You are suggesting that the court's process is flawed," he said, his voice firm, though the earlier edge of condescension was gone. Emily did not hesitate. "I am suggesting that the process, as documented, does not meet the standard required to enforce the charge," she answered. There was no accusation in her tone, no attempt to challenge authority, only a clear articulation of fact. And that was precisely what made it difficult to dismiss. The clerk shifted again, quietly pulling up additional records, while the prosecutor flipped through his notes with increasing urgency, searching for a point of recovery that was becoming harder to find. Judge Whitman's eyes moved between the documents and Emily, his expression tightening not from anger, but from the realization that the structure of the case was no longer stable. "If the notice is invalid," he said slowly, almost thinking aloud, "then the failure to appear cannot be sustained." The statement was not a ruling, not yet, but it marked a shift that everyone in the room could feel. Emily inclined her head slightly, not in victory, but in acknowledgement. "That is correct, Your Honor." The room went completely still. No one spoke. No one moved. The authority that had filled the space at the beginning of the hearing had not disappeared, but it had changed, redistributed, no longer centered where it once was. And in that quiet, undeniable shift, it became clear that what had begun as an attempt to diminish a quiet woman had instead exposed something far more fragile, a system that relied on assumptions, now confronted by someone who understood it better than anyone had expected. Judge Harold Whitman did not speak immediately, and that hesitation alone carried more weight than any ruling he could have delivered in that moment. because everyone in the room understood what it meant when a man known for absolute control chose silence. Instead of authority, his gaze remained fixed on the documents before him, but his mind was no longer moving through the case as a routine matter. It was recalculating, reassessing, searching for ground that had not already begun to shift beneath him. The prosecutor sat rigid now, his earlier confidence replaced by a quiet tension that showed in the way his fingers pressed against the edge of the table, as if holding on to something that was no longer stable. Emily Carter stood exactly where she had been from the beginning, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, but there was no longer any question about what that calm represented. It was not uncertainty, it was control, the kind that did not need to raise its voice to be heard. Judge Whitman finally exhaled slowly, lifting his eyes from the file and looking directly at her again, but this time there was no trace of dismissal, only a measured seriousness that acknowledged the shift that had taken place. "Ms. Carter," he said, his tone lower now, more deliberate, "you appear to have a detailed understanding of procedural law." It was not a question, and it was not a compliment. It was recognition, reluctant but unavoidable. Emily inclined her head slightly, her voice steady as ever. "I have studied it, Your Honor." The simplicity of the answer carried its own weight, because it did not attempt to impress. It only confirmed what was already becoming clear. In the gallery, the quiet observers who had once dismissed her now watched with focused attention, no longer spectators to a predictable outcome, but witnesses to something far more precise. Judge Whitman leaned back slightly, his fingers steepling together as he considered his next words carefully, aware now that anything said without precision could further weaken his position. "If what you are asserting is correct," he continued, "then the validity of this proceeding itself must be reviewed." The statement landed heavily, not as a final decision, but as an acknowledgement that the structure he had relied on was no longer intact. The clerk nodded subtly, already pulling up additional procedural guidelines, while the prosecutor shifted again, his expression tightening as he realized the direction this was moving. Emily did not rush to respond. She allowed the weight of the statement to settle, her silence reinforcing what had already been said without adding anything unnecessary. The room remained completely still, the kind of silence that only forms when certainty begins to collapse, and no one wants to be the first to acknowledge it. Judge Whitman's gaze moved once more between the documents and Emily, and for a brief moment, something unspoken passed through his expression, not frustration, not anger, but the recognition of a mistake that could no longer be concealed behind authority. "The court will take a brief recess to review the procedural record," he announced finally, his voice controlled, but lacking the earlier confidence that had filled the room. The sound of his gavel was measured, precise, yet it did not carry the same finality it once did. As people began to shift in their seats, whispering quietly among themselves, one thing had already become undeniable. The woman they had expected to correct had instead revealed a flaw no one else had noticed, and in doing so, she had changed not just the direction of the case, but the balance of power within the room itself, quietly, completely, and without ever raising her voice. The courtroom slowly came back to life after the brief recess was announced, but the energy had shifted in a way that could not be undone. Conversations that once carried quiet confidence now turned into low, uncertain whispers, and the same people who had dismissed Emily Carter just minutes earlier now glanced in her direction with a kind of cautious curiosity. She remained standing near the defense table, her hands resting lightly against the surface, her posture unchanged, as if the tension that filled the room had no weight on her at all. Across the aisle, the prosecutor leaned toward his notes, flipping through pages with controlled urgency, his earlier certainty now replaced by the careful movements of someone trying to recover ground that had already begun to slip. Judge Harold Whitman had stepped into his chambers, but his presence lingered in the room through the silence he left behind, a silence that now belonged to Emily as much as it did to the court itself. A young associate attorney in the second row whispered something to his colleague, pointing subtly toward the stack of documents Emily had brought with her, and for the first time, the question in the room was no longer who she was, but how much she already knew. Emily did not engage with the attention. Her focus remained on the file in front of her, flipping a single page with deliberate precision, confirming details she had already committed to memory. The clerk returned briefly to retrieve additional records, casting a quick glance in Emily's direction, not with skepticism, but with a quiet recognition that something unusual had just unfolded. Minutes passed, though they felt longer, stretched by anticipation rather than uncertainty, until the door behind the bench opened again. Judge Whitman stepped back into the courtroom, his expression composed, but noticeably more restrained, as if every movement had been reconsidered before being made. The room fell silent almost instantly, not out of routine respect, but because everyone understood that whatever came next would define what had just happened. Whitman took his seat, adjusting the papers in front of him with careful alignment, a small detail that did not go unnoticed by those watching closely. He did not look at Emily immediately. Instead, he glanced at the prosecutor first, then at the clerk, as though confirming something unspoken before finally lifting his gaze toward her. "The court has reviewed the procedural record," he said, his voice steady, though lacking the earlier edge that once carried unquestioned authority. The prosecutor straightened slightly, preparing to speak, but Whitman raised a hand just enough to stop him without a word. The message was clear: control of this moment no longer belonged where it had before. Emily remained still, her eyes steady, waiting, not anticipating, not reacting, simply allowing the process to unfold. "The timeline presented does raise a significant procedural concern," Whitman continued, each word measured, deliberate, leaving no room for misinterpretation. A faint shift moved through the gallery, not loud, but unmistakable, as realization settled deeper into the room. The prosecutor's jaw tightened slightly, though he said nothing, his earlier arguments now reduced to silence. Whitman paused, his gaze dropping briefly to the file before returning to Emily, and in that pause, something subtle but undeniable revealed itself, not hesitation, but acknowledgement. "Before proceeding further," he said, "the court must determine whether the notice issued meets the legal standard required for enforcement." The statement did not sound like a victory, but it carried the weight of one, because it confirmed what Emily had already established without ever declaring it outright. The room held its breath again, but this time the silence felt different, no longer tense with expectation, but grounded in a quiet understanding that the direction of this case had already changed. And standing there, unchanged in posture, unchanged in tone, Emily Carter had done something few ever managed to do in that courtroom. She had not fought the system, she had revealed it. The words settled into the courtroom with a quiet finality that no one could ignore, not because they were loud, but because they were precise, and precision in a place like this carried more power than any raised voice ever could. Judge Harold Whitman adjusted his posture slightly, his fingers aligning the documents in front of him as though order on the desk could restore order in the proceedings, but the shift had already happened, and everyone in the room could feel it. The prosecutor inhaled slowly, as if preparing to speak, but the pause stretched too long, and when he finally opened his mouth, the confidence that had once defined his tone was gone. "Your Honor," he began, his voice measured but uncertain. "Even if there is a discrepancy in the issuance of the notice, the intent of the directive remains enforceable under municipal authority." It was an attempt, careful, structured, but incomplete. Emily Carter did not interrupt. She allowed the argument to fully form, her stillness giving it space, and in doing so, revealing its weakness without needing to point to it immediately. Judge Whitman turned his attention toward her again, but this time there was no assumption behind the look, only expectation. "Ms. Carter," he said, "your response." Emily lifted her gaze, her expression unchanged, her voice calm, steady, and unmistakably controlled. "Intent does not replace jurisdictional validity, Your Honor," she replied. "If the process by which the directive was enforced does not meet the legal standard, then the authority to act on that directive is compromised." The room went completely silent. Not the kind of silence that follows confusion, but the kind that follows clarity, when everyone understands exactly what has just been said and cannot easily dismiss it. The prosecutor shifted again, his hand tightening slightly against the edge of the table, but no immediate counterargument came. Judge Whitman leaned forward just slightly, his eyes narrowing, not in resistance, but in concentration. "And your position," he said slowly, "is that the court lacks jurisdiction in this matter as presented." Emily did not hesitate. Based on the documented sequence of events, yes, Your Honor. The statement was direct, but not confrontational, and that distinction made it impossible to frame as defiance. It was simply fact, presented without emotion. The clerk glanced up briefly from the records, then back down again, continuing to review, though it was clear now that the conclusion was already forming. In the gallery, no one moved. Even the subtle shifts of posture had stopped. The room had narrowed its focus completely, drawn into a moment that no longer belonged to routine procedure. Judge Whitman exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping to the file one last time before returning to Emily. And in that moment, something changed again, not in the structure of the case, but in the recognition of who stood before him. The court finds that the procedural inconsistencies identified are material, he said, his voice steady, each word deliberate. As such, the notice does not meet the standard required to establish lawful enforcement. The words did not echo loudly, but they carried through the room with unmistakable clarity. The prosecutor lowered his gaze, saying nothing. There was nothing left to say. This matter is dismissed, Whitman continued, his tone controlled, though the weight of the decision was evident in the careful way it was delivered. Effective immediately. For a moment, no one reacted. The room held still, as if the finality of the ruling needed time to settle into something real. Then, quietly, almost imperceptibly, the shift completed itself. Emily Carter inclined her head once, not in triumph, not in relief, but in acknowledgement, and without another word, she gathered her documents with the same calm precision she had shown from the beginning. As she turned to leave, the marble floor echoed softly beneath her steps, and behind her, in a courtroom that had begun the morning certain of its power, a silence remained, not empty, but reflective, because what had just happened was not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, and for those who had witnessed it, it would not be forgotten. The soft echo of Emily Carter's footsteps faded into the hallway beyond the courtroom doors, yet no one inside moved to follow, as if the space itself needed time to process what had just unfolded. Judge Harold Whitman remained seated for a moment longer than usual, his hands resting on the bench, his posture still composed, but no longer untouchable. The authority he carried had not disappeared, but it had been reshaped, forced to confront something it had not expected to face that morning: precision without arrogance, knowledge without display, and strength without noise. Around the room, people began to gather their belongings slowly, though their movements lacked the usual rhythm of routine cases. Conversation started in low voices, measured and thoughtful, no longer casual, but reflective. A senior attorney near the back shook his head slightly, not in disbelief, but in recognition, as if acknowledging a lesson that had been quietly delivered in a way few ever witnessed. The prosecutor remained seated for a moment longer, staring at the file that had once seemed so certain, now reduced to a collection of overlooked details. He closed it carefully, not with frustration, but with the understanding that what had been missed was not complexity, but attention. At the bench, Judge Whitman finally rose, adjusting his robe with the same practiced motion he had performed countless times before, yet something in that movement had changed, subtle but undeniable. As he turned to leave, his gaze paused briefly toward the courtroom doors, the direction Emily had gone, and though no words were spoken, the moment carried a quiet acknowledgement, not of defeat, but of correction. Outside, the courthouse hallway buzzed with the distant sounds of other proceedings, footsteps, and quiet conversations, but Emily walked through it without drawing attention, her pace steady, her expression unchanged. She did not look back. She did not slow down. The outcome behind her did not alter the way she carried herself, because what she had come to do was never about proving others wrong. It was about ensuring that what was right was seen clearly. A clerk who had observed the hearing from inside stepped briefly into the hallway, watching her disappear into the flow of people, and for a second, he hesitated, as if considering saying something, but then stopped, realizing there was nothing to add to what had already been said without words. Back inside the courtroom, the final traces of the morning settled into silence once more, but it was not the same silence that had filled the room at the beginning. This one held something deeper, something that lingered beyond the case itself. Because what had been revealed was not just an error in process, but a reminder that authority, no matter how established, is only as strong as the integrity that supports it. And in that quiet realization, left behind in the stillness of polished marble and empty seats, the lesson remained, not spoken, not written, but understood, that respect is never secured by position alone. It is earned, quietly, by those who know exactly when to speak and when to let truth speak for itself.